Okay, should be quick this time. We're in Isaiah chapter 10, starting at verse 5. Get your Old Testament, turn over to Isaiah chapter 10, and we're picking up in 10, verse 5. This section is about God using Assyria, and I'm going to try to be quick. The longest chapter out of these three, 10, 11, and 12, will be chapter 11. Chapter 10, beginning in verse 5, God uses Assyria, calls her the rod of his anger, the staff of his indignation, and basically as you get down into 10:15, it's going to call Assyria God's axe. God's axe. Interesting stuff. Number one, he's using Assyria to judge his own people, but he's doing this to try to bring them back to repentance. Number one, this oracle, you've done your reading. You've read 10, 11, and 12, right? Okay. Number one, this oracle is probably to be dated at either 701 BC or later. 701, Sennacherib's invasion, or possibly even later. Damascus, Samaria, and Carchemish, and I've got the dates there for you in the workbook. Damascus in 732, Samaria 722, Carchemish 717, have already fallen. 10:9 says, basically 10:9 is asking rhetorically, haven't these cities or places already fallen? 10:9 is. And an invasion of Jerusalem is now in view. The rest of the context, verses 10 all the way through 32, is going to suggest that a sacking of Jerusalem is in view. So there are your blanks. 701 and invasion of Jerusalem in view. Okay, number two. Assyria is presented as the rod of God's anger. The staff of his indignation, again down in verse 15, his axe. God's going to use Assyria as his instrument. He's doing this, 10:6 says, he's sending Assyria against a godless nation, against the people of his fury, to capture booty and to seize plunder, to trample them down like mud in the streets. He doesn't intend to do God's bidding, 10:7 says. That's not his intent. We'll get those blanks on number 3 here in a second. But Assyria is not thinking of, I'm going to do God's bidding, any more than Cyrus. Cyrus, it says in Isaiah 45, was God's servant. But it explicitly also says in 45 verse 4 of Isaiah, he didn't know God. And I think that there are lots of secularists, materialists, that end up doing good things in God's ultimate plan for the world. And they're not even conscious that they're doing it with God's agenda in mind. They're serving God without even knowing it. It has nothing to do with their salvation, but they're serving God's big ultimate purpose unwittingly. So Assyria is doing that. 10 verses 5 down through 11 says. Now get these blanks on number 3. Assyria doesn't agree with the view that God has, that God is in control. Assyria would not say that she's doing God's bidding, but she is. So your first blank is God on number 3. It is not Assyria's intent or plan in her heart to do God's will. Later on in Isaiah chapters 36 through 39, Sennacherib is going to have the Rabshakeh, Assyrian official, come into the city and talk to Hezekiah and some of the others and basically say, well, it's Hezekiah's nobles that he talks to. And the Rabshakeh is going to say, basically, the Rabshakeh is going to simply say, we're not working for God. We're doing our own thing here. And that's how it is. Okay, number 4. This work, all through Assyria, is God's work. It says that in verse 12. The Lord has completed his work on Jerusalem, Mount Zion. 10 verse 12. It's God's work. He claims it. But elsewhere, and I've got the references here, it's called an unusual and an extraordinary work. Unusual and extraordinary. 28 verse 21. And later on in 29:14, it's called a marvelous work. And the reason it's called such is because God is working what would seem to be against his people. Usually God works for his people in the sense that they expect him to destroy their enemies, conquer their enemies. But here God's using the enemies to attack them. And therefore it's rendered as unusual or strange, extraordinary, and marvelous. Later on in chapter 29, God's going to be the one surrounding the city of Jerusalem. But he's surrounding Jerusalem by means of the Assyrians. More on that later. Number 5, the boast of Assyria, if you look at 13 and 14, is strikingly similar to the boast of Sennacherib on the Sennacherib prism. If I were in class with you, you need to look this up. If you've got Google open, take a look at it right now. Type in Sennacherib prism. You're going to have something like a canister, a cylinder, and again, it's a clay deal. They pressed Akkadian letters into it, and Sennacherib on his prism, secular writing now, claims to have had Hezekiah in the city of Jerusalem shut up like a bird in a cage. That is strikingly similar to what Isaiah has here in chapter 10 for us. In 10:14, he says, "My hand reached to the riches of the peoples like a nest. As one gathers abandoned eggs, I gathered all the earth. There was not one that flapped its wing or opened its beak or chirped." That's how Assyria views Jerusalem under the leadership of Hezekiah. Sennacherib moves in. He's surrounded the city. They feel like they've conquered Hezekiah and the city. But then the death angel intervenes, after Hezekiah humbles himself and goes to God in the temple. And so in Isaiah chapter 10, verses 13 and 14, it's strikingly similar to the boast of Sennacherib on the Sennacherib prism, where he boasts of having Hezekiah shut up like a bird in a cage. Number 6, Assyria is presented as an axe, verse 15, and or a saw that boasts against its wielder. Basically saying to the one holding it, the axe or the saw, and says to the instrument, or the instrument rather, says to the one holding it, basically, I'm the boss, you don't control me. Have you lost your mind? You've got to have somebody control you and that's what God's doing with Assyria. Assyria, whether she knows it, admits it or not, is under God's control. God's doing this in his ultimate plan, his ultimate scheme. Number 7, God is pictured as sending disease and fire upon Assyria when her work in judging or punishing Israel is through. This is all over the prophets. The prophets will say God raised up Babylon, and then it'll say in the same text, oh, and by the way, when Babylon's through, with God using her, he'll judge Babylon. God raises up. It's all over the prophetic literature. Assyria, Egypt, etc. And then when God's done his work, he'll judge them because they did wrong things as well. But God still takes credit for using them in his ultimate plan or his ultimate scheme. He's not condoning what they do, but he's taking credit and saying, I've got the whole purview of the world in front of me. I've got a big picture for the world, and I'm doing my part to try to redeem the world. Everything is under God's omniscience. And so he's aware of everything, and he's taking control of it in the best that he knows how in order to try to redeem the world. He's doing his part. The question is, are we doing ours? God had done his part. Assyria should have done hers. Judah should have done hers. We need to do ours. All right, number 7 on the back. Even an elementary child who can't count very high will be able to count the number of the Assyrian remnant. That's a metaphor. But if you look at it in verse 19, as the rest of the trees of his forest will be so small in number that a child could write them down. Child can count 1, 2, 3. Right now our daughter Blair counts 2, 9, 8. So maybe a little older than that, but the point is, it's going to be a small number. Children can't count all that high. And so he says, the remnant will be like a few trees that are hanging around, and a child could even write that down. He could count that high. All right, next section. The remnant shall return. You've got the remnant mentioned in 20, verse 20. Verse 21, Paul draws on some of this with his remnant theme. We've talked about that in the last segment, I think. And so it's difficult to know if Ephraim has fallen or not. If she has, it'd at least be after the year 722. But it says now in the day, the remnant of Israel. In that day, the remnant of Israel. The fact that the prophet sees a time in that day probably links us back to the earlier context where he's talking about Assyria, 10:5 through 19. So, maybe Ephraim, northern Israel, had fallen in that context. Look at the end of that, 15 through 19, and see if that doesn't make sense. In that day probably links us right back into the earlier oracle, 10:5 through 19. Number 9, it's probably the case that the prophet imagines in ideal imagery a united Israel with her remnant as being from both houses, Judah and Israel. Survivors from both. And then you've got this on the end of 9. The phrase, a remnant will return, taken out of verse 21, a remnant will return. The remnant of Jacob to the mighty God. is a word play on Isaiah's eldest son's name. Shar-Yashub, Shir-Jashub, his name means a remnant shall return. And so it's a word play on his oldest son's name. Number 10 has this. If we look at number 10, this is the way I've gone here. He says in verse 22, though your people, O Israel, may be like the sand of the sea, only a remnant within them will return. A destruction is determined, overflowing with righteousness. Could mean survivors. Could just mean survivors. And maybe that's not to be ruled out with what I'm about to say either. The remnant just being physical survivors. 10, 20 through 22. But the prophet Isaiah imagines after the desolation this remnant as trusting in God. They don't just return geographically. They return theologically, relationally, back to God. And so number 10, this group imagined by Isaiah after Assyria's oppression, the remnant is pictured as a group that will never again trust their oppressors but will rely. That's your blank on number 10. Rely or stay on the Holy One of Israel. Does that make sense? I think they do come home geographically, but the emphasis Isaiah is also making is as he imagines the post-oppression, after the Hitler of the day is gone, he imagines the remnant as not just being geographically returned, but theologically or relationally returned. They come home to God. So they are survivors physically, but they're more than survivors. They're faithful survivors. And there's there's a big difference there. All right, number 10. Paul makes something of this scenario in Romans 9. We've talked about that. The real remnant, both Paul and Isaiah are saying the same thing, by the way. The real righteous remnant are people living by faith. The real remnant in Israel is faithful Israel. Even if you had returned geographically but were far from God, you're not the real remnant God always intended you to be. God's intending for his real remnant to be a people of faith or faithfulness. Number 11, the people of Zion, Jerusalem, are told not to fear the Assyrian who is said to strike them with a rod. What God's really aiming to do with Assyria is trying to get the people to fear him, not Assyria. I mean, sure, fear Assyria, but reverence or awe or fear towards God is what he's aiming at. And that's what he's trying to get them to see. He's trying to educate his people. He's got their best interests at heart. He's trying to educate them by means of using Assyria. So he uses Assyria as a rod, number 11. Echoes back to some of these things like with Gideon's victory or the Exodus. You read that in 24 through 27. Number 12, the kind of desolation upon Assyria that's imagined here is not fulfilled in 701 BC. So if you look at verse 27, in that day his burden will be removed from your shoulders, his yoke from your neck, the yoke will be broken because of fatness. Assyria is not ultimately done until 612 at the Battle of Nineveh, when the Neo-Babylonians under the command of Nebuchadnezzar, son of Nebuzaradan, comes on in and busts them open in 612 at the Battle of Nineveh. Assyria doesn't fall until then. And we saw some of that in the historical sketch in the introduction, I think. But the point is the prophet is imagining after the oppression. He's imagining after the exile. Assyria will be gone. And while that doesn't happen historically in 701, Nahum later is going to present the full story. And Isaiah here is imagining it. Yeah, imagining it. With substance. God's promising here. But he doesn't give us a date or a name. And that's not his aim anyway. That's not his purpose. Isaiah is just simply saying, one of these days the dust is going to settle, and there's going to be the kind of day where God renders a victory. Sometimes Isaiah imagines it under the Messiah. Here he doesn't mention the Messiah, but he wouldn't not mention it either. If we were to ask Isaiah, are you talking about under the Messiah? He's going to say, yeah, that's where their hopes were. That's if they were to imagine it. They imagine the new temple. They imagine a Messiah, etc., etc., etc. And that's why God gives prophets, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Daniel, to say, it's not going to be immediately after the exile that the Messiah is going to arrive. But that's their hope. And that's how they paint it. And that's the image that all of the prophets contribute to. They're all aiming at that day. Acts 2, Acts 3. And that's the book of Acts. It's a book of fulfilled promises. All right. Number 13. The last segment here on chapter 10, 28 through 34. Isaiah presents the kind of route that Assyria would take when she would come in judgment upon Israel. Assyria would take. The kind of route she would take. Yeah, they come around and down. It's the enemy from the north, I think. Deuteronomy 28. covenantal curses were pronounced upon Israel. If they were faithless towards God, he said, I'm going to bring a nation from afar and they're going to come and gut you. Look at Deuteronomy 28:49 on that sometime. Look at Deuteronomy 28. Oh, well, look at 28:49 and then look at 28 all the way down to, I think, at verse 65. And it talks about the covenantal curses. And if they were faithless towards God, he said he was going to do this. A nation from afar, a nation from the north, he'd bring upon them. They would speak a different tongue than the Judeans. That's happening. That's happening. God promised it would. He's using Assyria, and she's coming down in this specific route, verses 28 through 32. At Nob, one of the villages of Judea, she's presented as shaking her fist at Jerusalem and saying, you're up next, verse 32. That's how 32 is supposed to be read. Number 14. Here, Assyria experiences her success. And it is Lebanon that falls. Now, I've got some notes here. You need to read both McGuigan and Willis on this. Read McGuigan and Willis on 10:34. Lebanon, 33 and 34. Lebanon always speaks of Israel or Israel's land in Isaiah's text, I think. And I've got the references there, 2:13, 14:8. You get the idea. But Ezekiel 31:3 paired with Isaiah 10:34 might suggest that this one case speaks of Assyria instead of Israel. Tough to say if Lebanon refers to Israel's land here then, or if it's actually talking about Lebanon having come under Assyrian jurisdiction. He will cut down the thickets of the forest with an iron axe, and Lebanon will fall by the mighty one. Is this God now attacking Israel still with Assyria, or is this God now attacking Assyria in Lebanon? Tough to say. Willis and McGuigan, if I remember correctly, are split on the matter. Give them both a read. See what you think. Either way, we get the big picture. Assyria is God's axe, staff, rod of his anger, and he's moved against Israel and Judah for Israel and Judah. He's got their best interests at heart. And one of those is the tree. Either Israel or Assyria is the tree chopped in verse 34. All right, that sends us into chapter 11. Everybody agrees that chapter 11 is messianic. It is messianic. I mean, there shouldn't even have to be a remark about that. Chapter 11 is messianic. Verse 1, the root or the shoot that will spring from the stem of Jesse, and a branch will bear from his roots. There's some linguistic stuff that's tricky about all that. I've got it there on number 2. You can look at some of those relevant texts where that word branch shows up. Sometimes it's the same word in the Hebrew text in other places. Sometimes it's not. But it's a messianic picture. And even when a different word is used, I'm convinced the whole idea ultimately swells up into a messianic thought or concept. Isaiah 53:2, Jeremiah 23, Zechariah 3, Zechariah 6, I will bring forth my servant, the branch. And the Messiah then, a Davidic descendant, a Davidic branch, the Messiah was mistakenly thought to be Hezekiah, Josiah, Zerubbabel, it looks like by my reading of texts like Jeremiah, 2 Kings, Zechariah. It looks like they think Hezekiah, Josiah, Zerubbabel, all of these, they're thinking, is he going to be the Messiah? But they're still thinking politically. They're still thinking patriotically, nationally, ethnically, physically. And so, texts again, like Daniel, cut in to say the Messiah is still not here. And they aren't even close to right in thinking about the Messiah anyway. Sure, he'll be a Judean descendant. Sure, he'll come out of David's line. Sure, he'll be a number of things they were right about. But the way that he was the Messiah was radically different. And you and I will talk about that in 2 Corinthians. He's no mere power hitter or warlord. Not in the typical way, anyway. He came as a selfless sacrificial servant. And so the Messiah and everything that they thought the Messiah to be, Jesus has to educate them on, and we find that in the Gospels. Even the closest of his disciples were so misguided on who or what the Messiah was to be. The identity of the Messiah, they are radically messed up on. And so Jesus educates them. All right, Isaiah chapter 11. Against the background of the Assyrian crisis, the assurance in the Messiah is contrasted. Assurance in the Messiah is contrasted. And in spite of the Assyrian exile, where they're thinking, is God faithless to the Davidic covenant? You look at Jeremiah 23 or look at Jeremiah 33 or Psalm 72 or Psalm 89. God promised to David, he said, I'm always going to be in covenant with your line. Well, when they go into exile and the temple is gutted and there's not a Judean monarch on the throne, the Jews are thinking, God's not been faithful to the covenant he made with the line of David. But there's a punitive clause in there. If you look at Psalm 89, 26 and following, or if you look at it in the 2 Samuel 7 record, 2 Samuel 7, 12 and following, God says about the line, the whole line. It's not just about Solomon. It's not just about Christ. It's about the whole Davidic line. God puts a punitive clause in there that says, if you're faithless, I'll chastise you, discipline you. And that's what's happening in the exile. God is being honest. He's being honest and he's being faithful in telling them the exile is me being faithful. I told you, you won't just get an unconditional line, but at the same time, God knows this ends in the Messiah. So they thought that the exile marked out God being faithless. It's the other way around. The exile is God's faithfulness to them and their best interests. And so, our first blank on number 1, the assurance in the Messiah is contrasted. And God does remain loyal or faithful to the covenant he had made with the house of David. Those texts there on number 1 are important texts. Oh, yes, they are. Number 2, a shoot would spring from the stem of Jesse and a branch out of his roots. That's the Messiah. The imagination of Isaiah the prophet is this is the Messiah. That's how they would have thought of him. That's how they do think of him. That's what this text reflects. I've got all the technicalities right there on number 2. Number 3, the Messiah, this is 11:2 now, is pictured as having the Spirit of the Lord. Give it some thought. Might even be 7 spirits of the Lord there. If so, then Revelation 3, 4, and 5 might draw on that. 7 spirit, having the 7 spirits of God. The Messiah has the 7 spirits of God. Give 11:2 a read in your own time. See if it's 6 or if it's 7. Might be 7 spirits of the Lord. If so, even if not, it wouldn't bother me. I'm just simply saying if 7, then that's the text Revelation's drawing on. And the attributes of the Messiah are identical to the description we get earlier. Wise, understanding, full of counsel, strength, knowledge, fear of the Lord. That sounds like the child of 9, 6, and 7. Isaiah 9, 6, and 7. It's because they're both messianic portraits. Isaiah is imagining the breaking forth of the Messiah, the Davidic descendant, the final Davidic descendant, and he's still on the throne according to Luke 1, 31 through 33. He's already on the throne according to the entire New Testament, and he's still on the throne according to texts like Luke 1, 1 Corinthians 15. All right, number 4, the Messiah is said to judge with righteousness. He's said to judge with righteousness, verses 3 through 5. Oh, in a world full of injustice, thank God that we have a king that we serve who is perfect in justice. And he can meter all that out. Perfect balance, perfect harmony. And you and I don't have to worry a thing about whether or not we're serving the right king or the right God or the right president. Thank God for that. My, isn't he great? Isn't he so much better than these other rulers we've seen in human history? Of course he is. The Messiah judges with righteousness. Out of his righteous, faithful character is what that means. And he'll strike with a rod. Isn't that something? You know, he's not so soft. Maybe we need to get a better view in the West of who the Messiah is. We've got this namby-pamby, wishy-washy, sissy Jesus view in the West in too many ways. But this one, he brings a rod. And that rod, if you look at the linguistics on it, the rod, shepherd's crook, wasn't only for bringing the sheep into the fold and taking care of them and coddling them. The rod was also for protecting them against the enemies, the real enemies. Look at Psalm 2, 7 through 9. See if he doesn't talk about smiting the nations with the rod. And see if that rod shows up again in Revelation and some other texts. See if that whole concept of Christ as the shepherd doesn't speak in 2 ways, both about the protection of the sheep, but also his antagonism against those who would oppose the sheep. It'd be a loveless God that wouldn't oppose the enemies who come against the sheep. So much for being the protector of them, right? You can't have the one without the other. And so necessarily the Messiah isn't just this sissified Jesus that the West might paint him to be. Okay, let's move on now to chapter 11, 6 through 9. So it's a messianic portrait. Most of our buddies in evangelical thought want to say this is a literalistic deal. They want to say this is literalism and that this vision has not yet been fulfilled, but there's coming a day where the wolf lies down with the lamb, and there's a day when the lion eats straw like the ox. And they say all of this is literal. Okay, I've already pointed out, last segment, I pointed out in Isaiah 35:9, another messianic portrait that says no lion will be there. Isaiah 35:9. Well, here in 11:7, you've got the lion. A young lion will eat, what does it say? The lion will eat straw like the ox, 11:7. Now we raise a question. Is there a lion in the Messiah's reign or not? Because 11 says there is, 35 says there's not. Literalism will have a problem there. That's a contradiction. You can't have both of those statements true if taken literally. Allegorically, you have a contradiction. Whatever you pick lion to symbolize or represent, you've got a blatant contradiction. But if we understand that both of these texts are just creating an idealistic, imagined portrait, we understand the point that the prophet's actually painting. He is painting a vision of peace. And it's not a legitimate contradiction then to say lions are there, but they're peaceful. No lions are there, so it's peaceful. The point he's painting in poetry, in figurative language, but not allegory, is a point about peace. And that's what Isaiah wants us to see. Isaiah 11, 6 through 9. All right, get this. Number 5, under the Messiah, Eden. It's a picture like the Garden of Eden, isn't it? Before the animals started warring with each other. Before humans ate the animals. It's a picture of Eden, the Garden of Eden. It takes us back to a restored creation. And that's the picture, that's the poetry we need to be picking up. So number 5, under the Messiah, Eden is pictured or imagined as being restored. We're going to see a picture later on in Isaiah 65 and 66 of a new heavens and a new earth. Guess what it's doing? It's taking us right back to Genesis and imagining the reversal as if we could extract the curse from our creation world right now. We're in a fallen creation right now, right? Adam caused it. Through his rebellion, he caused a fallen creation. Do you know that the New Testament says that Christ came to bring a new creation? Ephesians 2:10, 2:15, 2 Corinthians 5:17, Galatians 6:14 and 15, Romans 8:17 through 25. Interesting stuff. If you've got questions on the new creation, press me on another time, another place. But the picture we're getting here is a reversal of what Adam had introduced into the creation order of rebellion. God is, the imagination is when the Messiah comes, he's going to remove the curse and renew or recreate the creation. It's a picture that draws on Eden. Now, we've made this point. Just get the blank here real quick. This picture under the Messiah, number 5, contradicts other pictures under the Messiah. Isn't that right? Isn't that right? We've made that point. Verse 7, compare it with Isaiah 35:9. Yeah, that's a good point. All right, it is in that day. It is in that day under the Messiah. That's Isaiah's imagination. He's imagining under the Messiah. It's in that day, contextually, that the Gentile nations are imagined as incorporating into the nation. Verse 10. Look at that. In that day, the nations will resort to the root of Jesse, who will stand as a signal for the peoples. His resting place will be glorious. Oh, listen to this. You got to get this. All of our millennial buddies, our evangelical buddies who want to say that this text is yet to be fulfilled, my, it's striking when we hit Paul in Romans 15. You need to make a note of this, don't you? Romans 15 and verse 12, listen to this. Paul quotes the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, all 3 sections of the Old Testament. Luke 24, 44, and 45, Jesus said it like that. Those are the 3 parts of the law. He said, he opened their mind that they might understand the scriptures, Luke 24, 45, and he spake of himself, concerning himself, in the law, the prophets, and the writings, Luke 24, 44, all 3 sections of the Old Testament. Now watch this. In Romans 15, Paul does the same kind of thing, quotes all 3 sections of the law, and in Romans 15 and verse 12, Isaiah says, and he quotes Isaiah 11:10. Oh, guess what he's saying? Romans 15:8 says, God has confirmed the promises in Jesus as Messiah to the fathers. The promises that God made to Abraham on the behalf of all humanity, all nations of the earth will be blessed. That promise the promise that God made to all of humanity through and into Abraham? Guess what? Romans 15:8 says God's now fulfilled it, and he's fulfilled it in Jesus, and he quotes Isaiah 11 to say that this kind of picture we read in Isaiah 11 has already broken forth. Our evangelical buddies who say Isaiah 11 hasn't yet been fulfilled in our day need to listen to Paul. Paul says it had. Paul quotes it as a proof text to say that it has broken forth. The Messiah's kingdom, the Messiah's recreation, new creation, has already been inaugurated, according to Romans 15:12 and a trillion other texts. Luke 18:31, John 19:28, Acts 3:18, Luke 24:25 through 27, all over the New Testament. The point is made that God has fulfilled the trajectory that the whole old law, the schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, Galatians 3:19 through 25, has aimed at. He said in Romans chapter 10 and verse 4, for Christ is the end, telos, end, consummation or culmination. I think it's both. Or termination or culmination. I think it's both. He is both the terminus, the end, and the checkpoint of the law, of the Torah. Christ is the termination and culmination, Romans 10:4, of the Torah for everyone who believes. Romans 10:4. What's Paul saying? The whole aim of the prophets has happened. It's come to fruition in Jesus of Nazareth. Our evangelical buddies who think that this text is futuristic don't have a clue what they're talking about. They want to insist, you read Lindsay on this stuff, or you read Golden Gay, or some of the others, and they want to say this stuff is futuristic, hasn't been fulfilled yet. They're arguing with the entire New Testament. You can't say Christ is Lord and then say this hasn't been fulfilled. It's either messianic and is fulfilled in Jesus, or it's not. And then you get the millennial theory. We'll talk about it in Revelation, of course, won't we? That says, well, God was going to bring the kingdom in Christ in the first century, but he didn't expect the Jews to reject, and so we get this, they caught God off guard, so he postponed the kingdom. And now we're living in this interjection where God got the wool pulled over his eyes, and so we got to substitute the church instead of the kingdom, and one day in our future the kingdom's going to be set up, and you get the idea. The whole millennial scheme. Never going to go. Not if you take the New Testament seriously. I can see how the Jews say this hasn't been fulfilled yet. Religious Jews say this hasn't been fulfilled yet because they're still rejecting Jesus as Messiah. Now, we've got a debate to have with them on another point, I think, whether or not Jesus is the Messiah. Yeah, he is. But with evangelical Christians who say this stuff hasn't been fulfilled, off bad. They're missing it, and they're missing it in light of the entire New Testament. You can't say that the ethnic Jews are the people of God today and say that you're a New Testament Christian. That is incongruous. It's contradictory. You've got to scrap Paul. You've got to scrap Jesus. You've got to scrap the book of Acts. And all the rest of the New Testament too. Hebrews, the Gospels, won't go. It just won't go. All right. That's the blank on number 5. It should be especially noted that Paul sees this as already fulfilled in Jesus' work. Paul sees it as already fulfilled. All right, so Paul's saying the Messianic era has been inaugurated. It's broken forth. Now, chapter 11, 11 through 16, the ideal redemption. So we have in chapter 11, 1 through 5, the ideal ruler. 11, 6 through 9, the ideal kingdom. 11, 11 through 16, the ideal redemption. It says in chapter 11, verse 11, that God's going to recover his people the second time. What does that mean, the second time? He recovered them the first time out of Egyptian captivity. The second time he's going to recover them from Assyrian Babylonian. That's the point. Isaiah's imagining a new Exodus after a new oppressor, not Pharaoh this time. This time it's Assyria. Then the New Testament's going to piggyback on it again, both the Exodus and the exile, and say, and Jesus is bringing a new Exodus, and it's messianic, and it's even greater than what they thought they'd get when they came back home from Egypt or Assyria. All right, number 7, a gathering together or a uniting the kingdom of Israel again was a common feature of Israel's future eschatological hope. They thought that Ephraim and Manasseh and Dan and Asher all would reconvene and come one united kingdom again. Remember, you had Saul David, and Solomon, and then you get this split, Jeroboam and Rehoboam. The divided kingdom kicks off. You read all of this in 1 Kings, chapters 11 and 12. 1 Kings 11 and 12, the divided kingdom. Well, the expectation of the Jews was when the Messiah came, he'd work it all back out, and they'd all come back home and be right there united again. That's a piece of furniture in the vision or in the imagination of the prophet. That is a furniture piece. He's imagining. It's not allegory. It's not literalism. He's imagining the kind of thing that'd sound good to any Jew. Number 8, the prophet imagines a future victory over Israel's enemies. Verse 14, and deliverance from Egypt. Oh, he's not talking about deliverance from Egypt because they're really the modern oppressor in Isaiah's day. Egypt stands for slavery. He's telling them there's coming a day when God delivers you. You're going to be victorious just as you were over the Egyptians in the sea. You're going to be delivered from Egypt just as you were when you worked the plagues and got out of town. Egypt stands for slavery or for bondage. And that's what he's calling attention to. You can't read this and not get the new Exodus kind of picture. You just can't. I mean, you just can't. He talks then in verse 16, a highway running from Assyria, just like there was a highway jetting out of Egypt. Verse 16. I mean, look at 14 through 16, which I guess you've read this. But in 11, 14 through 16, all you have to do is read it with Egypt in mind. You say, yeah, he's talking about Egypt. He's talking about the deliverance from Egypt. So number 9, the highway, the idea of a highway running from Assyria to Egypt covers the entirety of the biblical world. All the way from Egypt, down here, all the way from Egypt, all the way to Assyria. That's the whole biblical world for that day and time. And he's saying there's going to be a highway going across the whole deal. It's a time of peace. God's worked his redemption. That's the kind of picture we get under the Messiah. It's an imagined picture. And then number 10, the entire picture is an imagined scenario under the Messiah. There you have it. Number 10, an imagined scenario under the Messiah. It's an imagined scenario under the Messiah. It's that kind of day. And if some of the furniture pieces aren't allegorically fulfilled or literally fulfilled, it doesn't bother us. The prophets aren't doing that. They're painting with big, broad brushes. Big old rollers. And this image that they get done painting, McGuigan's right. He says it this way. When they're done painting the collective image, McGuigan's right to remind us, we should see full portraits when we Westerners sometimes like to home in and look real close. And we see brush strokes where we should be seeing full portraits. There's an expression we have for that. Don't miss the forest for the trees. Don't look at the brush strokes when you should step back a ways and see full portraits. We've got a picture of a train hanging above my, it's in our guest bathroom above the commode. And if you were to stand there and look at it, you may not recognize it's a train if you're too close. It looks blotchy. You take a few steps back and you look at it and you see the big picture. It's a train coming around the mountain on a trestle bridge. I think sometimes we need to step back from the prophets, take in the whole deal. And if we see contradictions, it's not a problem. The prophets are all contributing with various furniture pieces and features to this one picture, this one collective image. When the Messiah comes, the oppressor's out, and the world's set right again. It doesn't matter if they say lions or no lions in the image. It doesn't matter if they say obliterated Gentiles or proselytized Gentiles. Contradiction? Well, if taken literally or allegorically. But they're all contributing to this big picture. And in this big portrait, there's a new temple and a new kingdom. And the Messiah's on the throne. And all of the tribes are back home. And some of the Gentiles are proselytes and they're obliterated, which is a contradiction if it's taken literally or allegorically. And there are lions, but there are no lions. They're all contributing to this big collective portrait of the kind of day that the Jews could appreciate in imagining what it'd be like when the Messiah broke forth. Chapter 12. Israel's song then of thanksgiving. Coming right off of chapter 11, Israel imagining the messianic redemption. Isaiah, for Israel, imagines the people as singing their thanks because of God's comfort. He imagines the people singing their thanks to God because of his comfort. We'll see that comfort is a messianic catchword for Isaiah. once we get to Isaiah 40 and following, the second bulk of the book, 40 through 66. Paul picks up on that in the New Testament. When he starts talking about comfort and messianic comfort, he's drawing on his favorite Old Testament book, Isaiah. Did you know that Isaiah is the favorite of Paul? He is. Hayes has an article on it in his The Conversion of the Imagination that's well worth your time to read. Number 2, twice Israel insists that she has learned the lesson that God is her salvation. Verse 2, God is her salvation. She's learned that lesson twice. In the Egyptian affair and the Assyrian affair. That's how the prophet imagines it. In God, Israel will trust and not be afraid. In God, Israel will trust and not be afraid. Number 3, ideally, under the Messiah, Israel is pictured as having the joy that would come from full wells. They have buckets full of salvation from God. Back in the prophets, and later than Isaiah, but still back in the prophets, you had some like Jeremiah who talked about the people as being empty cisterns, broken cisterns, dry cisterns. Not now, not imagined under the Messiah. Now they imagine it as having full wells, buckets full of salvation from God. Number 4, in this day, the messianic context given these chapters. Sometimes that phrase, in that day, is not messianic. I know what Wayne Jackson says. He is wrong. Number 4, in this day, God's name will be exalted. In this day, in the context under the Messiah, in that imagined scenario, God's name will be exalted, verse 4 says. And then number 5, God is praised for having done excellent things, verse 5. God is praised for having done excellent things, and he is called great and termed, here's our phrase, the Holy One of Israel. Tricky literature, tough literature, but well worth our time if we'll spend the time in it, learn about the God who can save, even by discipline, by punishment, by difficulty, as he brings difficulty like Assyria upon his own people, but he's got their best interests at heart. Don't tell me that God can't do things that we would term bad because they cut against our health and wealth. Don't tell me he can't do that. The Bible says he brought Nebuchadnezzar. The Bible says that he brought Assyria. The Bible said that he did it because he has a world to redeem. And maybe he's banking on us to bear such difficulties nobly, bear his glory in the thing, comfort others, communicate to others that we couldn't have communicated with if we hadn't gone through the difficulty. Maybe he's trying to educate us. Maybe we'd do well to read McGuigan's Celebrating the Wrath of God and see if there's not a big reason, a big picture of redemption in the world that God's got in store and that he's gunning for. And maybe we need to stop descending to these petty, naive points of health and wealth and just turn our lives over to God and say, we're going to trust you to redeem a world. We know you've got our best interests at heart. And whatever you're doing your thing to redeem a world. And maybe we'll pray like the Master did, and like the Master's half-brother taught us to in James 4. Maybe we'll just simply say, your will be done. Maybe we'll just turn our lives over and say, God, have it your way. Put me in your plan for the world's redemption. Let me submit to you and find a place and a purpose in redeeming the world and making this dark and dying world a better place. You committed to that thesis? Did you know God wants you to be? Did you know the book of Isaiah is teaching us something like that? If the Messiah was God's person to come and redeem, and God's telling us to be like him, and he was a sufferer, and he came and sat with us in all of our difficulties, maybe he's expecting people like you and me to go the distance for a world too. You think we can do it? I know we can do it, because God is faithful, and he's promised. And with the right perspective, led by the holy text, of course, God's holy revelation, he's counting on us to renew our perspective, have a bigger picture, a better picture for the world and its redemption, and he's asking us to fall in line with that. Let's study Isaiah 13 through 23 next time. Thanks. God bless you all.